Hello, so I'm Mike Bailey, and this is my co-presenter, Tom Bennett. I am wearing lederhosen because I heard there would be an Oktoberfest party, but in actuality, I can't attend it. But I was so excited that I put a reminder in my Outlook calendar when I accepted this invitation to speak to pack my lederhosen. So I'm just going to get the mileage out of these, and I hope that you go and enjoy the Oktoberfest party for me. Thank you very much for that. So we're both staff reverse engineers on the Flare team, and we've both looked at the Carbanak backdoor through very different lenses. In his case, the binary lens, and in my case, the source code lens. And what we're here to talk about is the unique experiences that came from that. And if you're not familiar, the Carbanak backdoor is associated with millions of dollars of financial crimes perpetrated in large part by the Russian Fin7 threat group. We're going to try to keep this pretty accessible for people who are both at the malware analyst level and also at the InfoSec professional level. And we're going to talk about some of the unique experiences from that source code kind of journey. It's not very common that somebody laboriously and tediously analyzes all the binaries and has to sweat through analyzing actually hundreds of binaries, and then somebody else gets to analyze the source code and see if they were right. So we're going to go through a little bit of background here and talk about Fin7 and Carbanak. We'll talk about some of the more interesting considerations with regard to that source code. We will revisit Tom's binary analysis, and he'll be under a little bit of pressure at that moment. And we'll talk about some blind spots that Tom really couldn't have possibly seen from a binary level, and things that we were introduced to from the source code. And then we'll actually show you a few more binaries that Tom didn't have access to because they just weren't with, we didn't accompany the backdoor. And we'll talk about some video artifacts, which will be very interesting and juicy. So just to introduce myself a little further, I'm the guy that analyzed the source code, and my name is Michael Bailey. And I live and work in Huntsville, Alabama, remotely for the Flare team. I play the banjo, but I'm from Wisconsin. It's not because I'm an Alabamian. I'm a daddy, too. I spin drum and bass music, and I also write lots of debuggers for the mean, bad malware that we get to look at on the Flare team. And I maintain the FakeNet-NG project, which is an internet simulator that lets malware talk to something that it thinks is its command and control server, so we can hear who it wants to talk to and hear what it is saying. I'll let the binary guy introduce himself.
Hey, everyone. My name's James Bennett. People call me Tom. It's my middle name, and there's no real fun story behind that. So you might see James or Tom on papers and blogs I've written in the past. Either way, I'm based in SoCal. I work from home. I'm also a staff reverse engineer on the Flare team. I'd say roughly the first half of my career was focused on a higher level analysis of malware, but at a large scale. I used to work for an antivirus company, Trend Micro, so I cared more about detection than about understanding the code at a really low level. And then halfway through my career, roughly, I switched focus and I got really interested in reverse engineering. So instead of analyzing a lot of samples at a higher level, I focused on individual samples at a really deep level. And that's why I'm on the Flare team now, reverse engineering malware and writing reports for our customers. And for fun, I like video games and hiking.
So the Flare team that we're a part of is FireEye's enclave of reverse engineers. And we support the talented staff in the advanced practices team. We support our incident responders who throw malware over the fence to be analyzed, managed defenders who take care of the companies who pay us to patrol their networks. We also work with iSight for intelligence purposes. We do a lot of threat intelligence work. We do trainings, both internally and externally, including trainings that have been done here. We just taught Malware Essentials at Cyber Defense Summit just Monday and Tuesday. And we also do blogging and, like I said, teaching, and some research for product detection, and also some red team work. So sometimes we write proofs of concept for novel evasions and what have you. Because reverse engineering is the main service that we provide, I want to let Tom talk a little bit about it, just briefly. And because he's the guy that got to analyze the source code, or the binary code, I want him to talk about that and the background that he had available to him when he did his analysis.
Right, so like Mike mentioned, we wanted to keep this accessible to a larger audience, and we're using terms like binary and assembly, disassembly, and compilation, and that might not be as familiar, thank you, to some of you. So I'm going to keep this really short and do like a nutshell version of this, but basically you have programmers writing their code in a high-level language like C that other programmers can understand, and then they compile that. And during the compilation process, lots of important information like function names and function variables get lost, and those high-level instructions get broken down into many more low-level instructions known as assembly. And that assembly gets translated into the bits and bytes of the binary that the computer can understand so it can run the program. And what we end up with is an executable, and we call that binary sometimes. So as a reverse engineer, we typically don't get access to that source code, right? We wish we did. It would make our job a lot easier, but also, I guess, less fun. We like to do what we do at the bottom here, this disassembly and this reverse engineering process. So we use a tool like a disassembler that will take those bits and bytes out of the binary and convert them back to that assembly-level language that we can read. And we analyze that, and we come to our conclusions and write our reports on that. And sometimes we have an additional tool called the decompiler that can further abstract those low-level assembly instructions back into a C-level source code representation. That's not going to be the same as the actual source code that was used to write the program. The names are all gone, and it's also usually messier. But sometimes it's helpful. So we spend a lot of our time with the assembly and the decompilation. Where do you click here? Just
right in the center.
Right in the center.
Detonate.
Thank you. All right, so we're talking about Carbanak today. It's a sophisticated and versatile backdoor. It's originally known as Anunnaki, actually. The malware authors called it Anunnaki. You can see in the source code and in the strings of the binary that it was originally named Anunnaki. But a lot of the blogs and papers that came out about this backdoor, they coined the name Carbanak, and that's the name that we know it as today, right? So it's, again, sophisticated. We've seen it going back as early as early 2014. It's used by select criminal groups, including the Carbanak group. And I put my quote fingers around Carbanak group because at FireEye we believe that there is no one single Carbanak group, but actually the Carbanak backdoor is shared among several groups, at least a few different groups that have a sort of trust relationship with each other and are willing to share this backdoor. It is a private backdoor. It's not like Poison Ivy or something that you can just download off the web and use it for whatever you want. And in the summer of 2016, one of our clients asked for a full analysis report. And I took that ticket, and Tom spent his summer vacation reverse engineering Carbanak. I probably spent over 2 months looking at like 3 or 4 Carbanak binaries and writing a report for it. And we also wanted to mention Fin7. So Fin7 is one of those groups that we talked about that had access to the Carbanak backdoor. These guys are professionals. They're a Russian financial criminal group. They typically like to target payment card data, but they are opportunists and they're flexible, and whatever they can get that's worth something, they might just decide to go after. You can see we've had our eye on them for some time. We've written a lot of blogs and papers about these guys and their tools and their tactics. And of important note, in August 1st of this year, the FBI indicted 3 members of the Fin7 group. And they actually revealed something very interesting, that this group was operating a security company, again, using my quotation fingers. Combi Security. They had a website, they had a LinkedIn presence, and they were actually recruiting people. And they hired them on, and we believe these guys were unwitting accomplices to these financial crimes that were being perpetrated by Fin7 groups. So that was a very interesting discovery.
Yeah, so thanks to the magic of our cyber sleuth team, the advanced practices team, FireEye captured the source code for Carbanak. And so one Monday morning, I logged in, and I decided to look at what the next ticket was for me to analyze. Normally, it's a little backdoor or a proxy or just a little piece of malware. In this case, it was something that my buddy here thought was absurd. He said, "Did you take the Whopper ticket?" And then he said, that could take like months, but it was a little bit late because I already took it. And the reason why he said it was a little absurd, it was 20 megabytes of files. It was 100,000 lines of code, 40 binaries, and 15 of those were pieces of malware. Well, really 14 technically. So what does Russian source code look like? Ironically, it's written in pretty good English. But on the right-hand side and up above, you can see that it's decorated with a lot of Russian language words. And this document is code page 1251, and that's Cyrillic script, and it has a lot of words that I'd like to know. I'm not a Russian speaker. Now, the Flare team has a lot of fluent Russian speakers, or at least a few, and I'm not one of them, but I took this ticket. So I wanted to get something out of all this. Like, what does this mean? Really important to me to figure that out. I've got the source code, let's make something of it. So I went to the freebie bin at the bookstore. Just kidding, just kidding, just kidding. No, so what I did is I wrote a Python script, like any reverse engineer would do. And I tore through all the files, and I found all the non-Latin words, and I grouped them by order of their frequency of occurrence, and I built a 3,400-word vocabulary list for myself. And I studied this list, the whole list. No, I'm just kidding. I studied 500 words here, and I looked them all up. That's what I did. And I went onto RussianForEveryone.com while my daughter was playing and watching TV and napping, because I was totally into this and not playing with her that day. bad daddy. But I had a great time learning a lot of Russian. And so I did that also so I could bring this Malware Analyst Russian lesson to you. I'm going to go down this list for you and tell you how these words are pronounced. They'll sound a little familiar to you. Unit 1 of your Russian lesson, okay? File, server, address, command, bota, plugin, service, and process. So if I had known Russian was going to be that easy, I probably would have studied it earlier. Yeah. Obviously, there were some other words that were a little more complicated than that. But studying this gave me the ability to translate the user interfaces that were present in the source code base. So this is a really fun example of one of the user interfaces I translated. It's the command and control panel for commanding infected hosts. And probably the most amusing part of this has got to be the launch a socks proxy icon with the literal pair of socks on it. I really had to hand it to the developers for making my job fun that day. So having the source code is kind of like God mode, X-ray vision, game over, right? Or maybe not. I'm actually going to let Tom here set up an example that's it'll run to the contrary, I guess I'll say. I can hold the detonate.
Oh, yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
All right, so usually when I'm reversing a backdoor, I know there's going to be a point in the code where the commands come in from the client, and then they're going to process that command and come to some code that executes the command for it, right? And typically, your average backdoor is going to have like 1 or 2 functions that deal with handling commands. Carbanak had 7. Right? And I put a screenshot of each of these functions here. These are control flow graphs from IDOPRO, just kind of showing you the logical flow of how a function would look visually, right? So a command would come into Carbanak and actually go through this little journey. It's not really a little journey. Actually, it's quite a long journey through the code before it ends up at the actual functionality itself, right? And not only is it going through these functions, but it's also going through these named pipes. Now, named pipes on Windows, it's this mechanism. It's kind of like a file, where you can write into a name pipe and you can read out of a name pipe, but it doesn't leave any file on the file system. And Carbanak used several of these to talk to itself in different places. So one function or a process or thread would write into one of these name pipes, and then another function, thread, or process would read out of it. It's kind of like a telephone, so it can talk to itself, right? So Carbanak supports over 40 commands. And I had to follow this journey for every one of those 40 commands. I had to map out which functions it went through, which branches it took, and which name pipes it went over. And it was so complicated that I actually had to actually create a map. So in my notes, I had a map to show where every command went, so I could follow it back later when I needed to refer to that command. And thankfully, with IDOPRO, it did help quite a bit. I could keep a tab open for every one of these functions and flip between them pretty easily. And with cross-references and being able to dive in and out of functions, it wasn't as complicated or as bad as I thought it could have been. But I think Mike has a different story looking at the source code.
Yeah, my journey was a little bit more like Frodo and Samwise Gamgee getting ready to go do the Fellowship of the Ring trilogy. This on the right isn't meant for you to read. It's literally just there to show you the depth of all the different functions that were involved. And I want to whip through, really breeze through just 20 or 25 functions relating to the secure command. We'll follow the secure command down its journey to the very, very bottom end where it does its job and sets up persistence by installing a malicious notification package so that when you reboot, Carbanak will still be there waiting for you. So this is the command that initially handles the secure command. And it calls load plugin, which you'd think would somehow load a plugin. What it really does is call 2 different functions depending upon which kind of C2 they're using today to go and get their plugins. And those 2 functions then call potentially 2 different send functions with different types of messages depending on the C2 protocol they're using. And then that causes a write operation, which causes another write operation at some other lower level, which causes a write file operation, which is a Windows function. And that's where the trail runs a little bit cold. Basically, they say something into the telephone, and then I have to go figure out who's on the other end. Here's what's on the other end of the named pipe. It's another function with a whole bunch of different possible messages. They call a function that will run a thread, that will call a function that calls a function pointer, that calls another function pointer, that calls another, oh yeah, okay, this is where that gets sent over a pipe and then received, and they say they're going to load a plugin here, but they're really going to talk over another named pipe. So they send a string over a named pipe, and then another send operation, and another lower level. Okay, here's where we receive that, and we handle that asynchronously. And we're going to load a plugin maybe, or are you going to do this to me again? I don't know. Oh yeah, it actually does download the plugin, decrypts it, and then finally, miles back at the beginning of our journey, This is where we were initially handling the secure command. It's the first thing I showed you. And I'm highlighting 2 function pointers that they've set up and stashed into a structure that they're going to pass in. And so I'm all that way deep back in all those levels of nested functions. And finally, I'm like, what is this function pointer equal to? Are you serious right now? So I had to trace all the way back and figure that out. So here it's a function pointer that calls another function pointer. And finally, at the dead end of it, it finally calls this, which is what installs a malicious notification package. So the control flow was divergent depending on what kind of C2 they were using, because they can opt to use one kind or another, and a different server as well for downloading plugins versus downloading commands. And the control flow diverged based on the fact that they were using C++ with overloaded functions that have the same name. And then there were functions that had the same name but were in different namespaces. And I feel like we saw load plugin like 3 or 5 times. It was super confusing, to be honest. And so if I had to write a book about it, I think this would be the book cover, Carbanak source code analysis. And then I'd scratch my eyes out and never be seen again. So surely, Mike, you must be saying, surely, Mike, there must be cases where having the source code is easier. And I would say to you, yes, definitely there are. So here is a case where having this is an old slide. OK, well, anyway. So in this case, the source code is we're looking at decompilation. It's not the source code. We're looking at an optimized comparison here, where Carbanak is assessing for each process name in the operating system, it's going to derive a unique number and compare it with a very long list of other unique numbers that it has hard-coded in the binary. And they're all doing this also that the malware analysts can't figure out what processes they're looking for. They're looking for specific processes to detect something, but we don't know what. And at the source code level, it actually is a lot cleaner. It's like a really organized block of trend micro process names, and then the comments on the right-hand side just tell me exactly what they're looking for. And then in the middle, we have AVG. And at the end, we're looking for Kaspersky. So if it matches any of these, it'll drop to here and return this. Or if it matches these, it'll return this. Or if it matches these, it'll return this. Another thing at the source code level that you get to see is things that were completely commented out, like this AV evasion for AVG, which if I were to uncomment it, it'd be a little easier to read with the syntax highlighting. But what they're doing is they're looking for an AVG DLL that might be stitched into their process address space. And if they find it, they will locate the entry point, which is the first function that normally gets called in any binary. They would locate the entry point of AVG's DLL, and they'd say, hey, AVG, we're unloading now. It's time to go home. Like, the process is closing and terminating. You need to unload so that everything can happen nicely. And AVG is totally compliant. We tested this in late 2017. It's a new DLL. They have a different DLL name, but it totally still works, so we disclosed that to them. Another example is an active AV evasion that we saw for Trend Micro, where you used to work. Fun times. So this, I won't speak in great detail, but you can read the details if you're interested. Basically uses a different, like an alternate way of injecting process, what's called process injection. So injecting code into another process. And it evades the state machine or heuristics that Trend Micro has implemented and slips right under the radar. So in that block of code before where I was saying that they're figuring out what antivirus is in place on the machine, that is where they would decide that this is the method that they want to use. And so we disclosed that as well and actually got a pretty positive response. A couple months later, Trend Micro implemented a feature called aggressive event detection. And if you enable it, it will detect that. So if you work at Mandiant, you feel a certain pressure when you do anything to try to figure out who the people behind the keyboard are. Mandiant is where the APT1 report came from, which was the seminal threat intelligence distillation of like unmasking the hackers behind the keyboard. It had pictures of people from their forum postings and like actual pictures of human beings who typed these bad things into the console from the Chinese People's Liberation Army. So I thought I should look for some of that stuff. So I did. I gave it a shot. It didn't really turn out that well. Turns out one of the usernames corresponds to a video game character in a game called Touhou. Another one is Igor, which is like the most common name ever, and the list goes on. Basically, nothing conclusive from this. I mean, if we see these again, it might mean something, but it didn't really tie to any specific person or threat actor. So that was a dud. I felt like it was an open-ended question, just like he said, like, it's pretty open-ended. What are you going to do, like, spend a couple months on it? I did. And I kind of did a survey. I felt like I was in charge of my own like plan for how to do this. So I just said, fine, I'm going to look for all the exploits and see what exploits are stitched in here. And I did. And I had this list. So I'm not going to talk about all these exploits in great detail, except I will say that they all can be found publicly. These are all things that you can find on the Rapid7 repository, or you can find them on ExploitDB, or you can find them written about in random blogs that have to do with security. And all they did is take the source code verbatim and then just mash it into their source code base. And it was a really effective, productive way to do business. I also felt like I had to go find any secrets, key material, passwords, etc., that might be in the source code base. And I did. I found some C2 passwords on the far top left there. In the center, I found some private key material that was embedded in a binary and encoded. But basically, it was in the plane for me to go pick out. And there was an encrypted certificate file that I brute forced. And the password was the single character, the number 1. So it was really disappointing to write that brute forcer. But it ended up, this is kind of another dud, it was for test company. So all these almost were for testing. Nothing really particularly interesting there. I thought I would be a whiz kid and find some new network-based indicators that FireEye didn't know about, but that also turned out to be a dud. We knew about all of these from our tracking. So everything's all tagged up in threat intelligence, and these all correspond to operations that we already know about. So Intel's already on top of it, I have to say. So at this point, I think we can lean on Tom to see how we did in our blog. He did this extravagant blog with Barry Van Gerich of the Advanced Practices team, and he's going to talk about that.
Hey, there's Barry. Hey, man.
Neat.
Nice to meet you in person. So Barry and I, he's from our Advanced Practices team, like Mike said. A little over a year ago, we worked on a blog together. And this blog kind of added some additional technical details that we didn't see in previous blogs on Carbanak. And we also shared some novel insights into the operations and the users of the Carbanak tool. And we came to several conclusions based on our research. And this is an additional month of research after I already spent 2 months on the analysis, just a month on this blog alone. And I wanted to share a bit about that research before we talk about those conclusions. But the main thing is, now that we have the source code, can we actually prove any of these conclusions to be accurate or not, right? So we put these forward with a fair level of confidence, but you never fully know, usually, except in this case now we do. So let's talk about that. So behind the blog, I've seen that over the years, the Flare team had a lot of tickets submitted for Carbanak, right? So a lot of people wanted us to analyze Carbanak samples over the years. So if I had to guess at the time that I was doing this research, I would have thought there may have been dozens of Carbanak samples in our malware repository. And these samples are easy to hunt for. They're fairly large and have a lot of unique characteristics, so writing a signature to find them in our repo is not a big deal. But the problem was that these samples were always packed. When I say packed, I mean they're either compressed or encrypted or obfuscated in some way. So even if we could find them, we couldn't really pull anything useful out of them in that state. But I also knew that at FireEye, we have a few generic automated unpacking services at our disposal. So these services are usually pretty good. They don't work on every single sample, of course, but they take a generic approach to getting memory dumps of malware. And for Carbanak, it worked every time, which was really cool. So I knew we had a big repo of malware. I knew we had at least dozens of Carbanak samples. We had the signatures to find it, and we have a way to unpack them automatically. So I threw together some scripts to do all that. And what I found was not dozens of samples, but hundreds, which was really exciting. Really cool, and I knew we could pull a lot of neat data out of there. But some of the data I was pulling out was actually exposing some of our customers. So there's some customer-sensitive data that I was pulling out. So I had to be careful. Barry helped out by going through and culling that list. So any sample that we thought was sensitive, we pulled out. And even after doing that, we still had 220 samples that we could talk about. So that's a lot, right? A lot more than I thought. So what kind of data was I pulling out? I started with the original compile time for these samples, right? So in Windows, in Visual Studio, when you compile your project, the compiler is going to add a timestamp into the headers of your executable that tell you when that sample was compiled, right? And unfortunately, with Carbanak, when the Carbanak samples were packed, that compile time gets lost by another compile time, which is the compile time of the packed version of the sample. And I didn't care about when the packed sample was compiled. I wanted to know when the original Carbanak binary inside of it was compiled. And we were able to pull that out because we were dumping the memory of the original binary itself. So we could get the original compile times. And one thing I noted in these hundreds of samples, and again, these samples span a few years of compilation times, I noted there were 5 different versions of their command and control protocol implemented throughout these sample set, right? So each version of the command and control protocol kind of built upon the previous version, like improving its encryption or its security, making it harder to reverse engineer. And so it sort of went through this evolution over the years. So I was able to tell you exactly which version of the protocol each sample had implemented in it. Right? So now I had a timeline going. I had the compile time, and I had the protocol version. And lastly, I pulled out the command and control addresses and their ports, along with the campaign code. And for those of you who don't know what I mean by campaign code, it's basically a unique string that the operator of the malware will configure into it that will identify the target. Right? So when the Carbanak gets down on some system and infects it, and it calls back out, it needs to report itself as someone or something so that the operator knows who it's actually dealing with. Right? So that's what the campaign code's for. Usually it's going to be a date, like a month or a week or a day. Or it might be like an industry vertical, so it's like, oh, we're targeting this industry for this campaign, so we'll use that string. But sometimes it's actually the customer name itself, or like an abbreviation of the name of the target itself. And that's why we had to call some of the samples from our set.
I've advanced you.
Right. Yep. Cool, thanks. So we have all this data. One of the conclusions I wanted to talk about from our blog today was because we have all this data, I believed strongly that there was likely a build tool being used by these guys. So they could take a template Carbanak binary, put it in this build tool, and bake in some configuration and produce a new sample to distribute. And I believe that that build tool likely allowed them to configure the C2 address, the C2 encryption key, and the campaign code, at the very least. But why did I think that way? Well, I noted that in all these 220 samples I was looking at, the strings in the binary were encrypted with a different key every single time. And I thought to myself, I can't imagine some guy sitting at his desk with Visual Studio manually typing out a new key and recompiling a build for all 220 samples, right? That doesn't make a lot of sense. So I knew there was some automation here and some modification of the binary after the fact. And I also noted that there were a lot of samples that had the exact same compile time, but the C2 addresses would be different inside, and the C2 encryption key would be different. So they were able to change data in the binary without recompiling. Right? So again, this is all tips that there's a build tool being used. And if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say encrypting strings, just very simply, when you write a program, you're going to have strings in your program, things like which APIs you're going to call, URLs, IP addresses, file names, things like that. These are all human-readable characters, right? And you can run a tool on these binaries to dump those strings. And even if you're not a reverse engineer, you can do some pretty neat analysis just by reading the strings and saying, oh, I think it's probably going to do something like this. I see all these key names, so it's probably going to do key logging or something, right? Strings analysis, really neat stuff. So a lot of malware want to encrypt their strings, so it's not so easy to do that. And Carbanak was one of these malware that did so. So what do the source dumps say? Is there a build tool? Bingo, we got a build tool. So this was really neat. I was really excited to see this, and it definitely proved a lot of the conclusion that we put in the blog. I wanted to, thanks to Mike, we have a translation here of this GUI, and thanks, Mike. So on the right, I just want to point out a few of the things in this build tool. We have this, let me grab my laser pointer. It's easier. Yeah, so we have this button over here, create exe. And you can see to the left of that, we have two fields, input file and output file. The input file field is going to be where you designate your template binary that's going to be used for the build. Right? So you have some compiled version of Carbanak that you want to use, and you point to it with the input file. The output file is going to be the new Carbanak build that's built by the build tool with all your configuration baked in, right? And the new encrypted strings. You can see down here we have admin host. These are where you put your C2 addresses and your ports. Up here we have the prefix field. They call it prefix. This is what we call the campaign code, but that's where you put your campaign code identifier up here. And then down here we have admin password. Well, this is the string that's going to be used to derive the C2 encryption key used by the binary, right? So it looks like we were right about all that, except I don't see anything about the encrypted strings here in this GUI, right? So where would I find that?
You got to do this one.
I got to use that one.
Yeah, I got it. Just did it.
Thank you.
Oh,
all right.
Nope. Can you go back one?
No, that's it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's it.
Don't go back one.
All right. So I had to go to the source code to figure out more about the encrypted strings. I wanted to know if I was right about that. Is the build tool actually re-encrypting the strings every time that it builds a new sample? So over on the left here, we have source code from the actual Carbanak backdoor. And there's a function, it's a macro they call CS, which means code string. And you can wrap your strings that you want to be encrypted with this CS macro, and it's going to automatically encrypt them for you. But what's actually happening is for every string that you do that, it's prepending that string with the string BS and appending ES. So it's kind of sandwiching all your strings with these BS and ES markers, right? And I didn't, I kind of figured BS stood for begin string and ES stood for end string. And you can see here, we ran the strings tool that dumps all the strings out of the template binary, and you have all the strings with the BS and ES. And I looked in the builder header file and saw, in fact, BS stands for begin encode string, and ES stands for end encode string. So what's happening here? You run the build tool. It's going to search for these BS and ES markers in all the strings in the binary. When it finds them, it pulls the string out between them, encrypts it with a new key, and then puts it back in the binary. And that's how they're able to, without any effort, have newly encrypted strings every single time, which is really great for them, OPSEC-wise, because for us as reverse engineers, we literally have to find that key in every sample and rerun our string decryption plugins in IDAPRO to decrypt all the strings again so that we can see what we're looking at, right? So it does add extra work for us. So again, a really cool discovery. But what about those template binaries, right? So another conclusion from the blog. I noted that due to the frequency and the close proximity of the compilations of Carbanak that we saw in our set, I thought that we were probably dealing with the fact that operators had access to the source code themselves. So why did I think that? So spanning just over 2 years of the sample set I was looking at, I saw over 57 unique compile times. That's a lot of compile times for 2 years, in my opinion anyways, especially when you have a build tool, right? So you already have a build tool. Why are you recompiling all the time? I also noted that some of these samples were compiled within just 4 hours of each other. So again, what's up? Why are you compiling, again, when you already have a build tool, and again, just 4 hours after you just compiled, right? And these really close proximity binaries that we were looking at, they had the exact same configuration. So they didn't even, what are they changing? That's what I wanted to know. They're not using the build tool. They're just still changing something in the code and recompiling. So what were they doing? For that, I had to go to the binaries itself. So I have sample A on the left and sample B on the right. This is the same function in both samples. And this is just the same, this is the disassembly from IDAPRO. And I pointed out just 2 differences between this function in both of the samples. In sample A at the bottom, there's an additional call to this run thread function. And it's calling this thread pause log monitor thread. That's what I named it, right? This is my analysis, right? So pause log monitor thread, it simply looks for a log file from a point of sale software and uploads it to their command and control server, all right? So in sample B, at the top, there's an additional run thread call that's not in sample A. This is running a thread called BlizzCo thread. So I didn't know what BlizzCo was at the time, but it turns out it's like the Russian PayPal. It's a way for Russians to send money to each other online. And it's basically trying to determine, is this a user of BlizzCo? The person on this computer, do they use BlizzCo or not? So what does the source dump say about these little changes I saw in the binary? Well, it turns out they're using something known as preprocessor directives. So you see there's this if-def and end-if statement, and whatever's in between that is code that could either optionally be included in the project or excluded from the project when you compile. All right, so every time you compile, you can enable or disable these macros to include or exclude optional code. Right? So we see this macro at the top, plugins trusted hosts. Right? And if that's enabled, then it's going to run thread the trusted host thread. Well, that trusted host thread, thank you for my laser. That trusted host thread is the BlizzCo thread that I was talking about, right? So all they have to do is enable or disable this macro in their project, and they can enable this functionality or not include it in the project. And then at the bottom, we see this other macro, plugins monitoring file, and that's going to run the monitoring files thread if it's enabled. And that is the pause log monitor thread that I named. So it's looking for that point of sales log, right? So it turns out these operators are using these macros to easily enable and disable functionality to fine-tune their Carbanak builds for particular targets, right? So this is in addition to using the build tool. And there's one other interesting discovery that I made, switching back. So one more piece of information that also really helped solidify this theory that I had in my mind is I saw some samples of Carbanak that were using outdated versions of the protocol. So just for one example to clarify what I mean. I found a Carbanak sample that was compiled in June of 2016. However, it was implementing protocol version 4. And protocol version 5 had already been available for 2 months. So how is that possible? If there's just one place where the source code sits, it's very unlikely that there would be a sample that's compiled after 2 months after the new version of the protocol already exists, but it's using the old version. So all this together, the fine-tuning, the macros, enabling, disabling, and using outdated protocol, it all led me to this theory that it's very likely that there's multiple independent copies of this Carbanak project in existence, right? And that there's not one single place, but the source is shared with operators that trust, they trust each other. There's this trust here. Thank you. So, changing topics a little bit, I wanted to play a game of how is my reversing, right? Again, I'm like a little kid here. We don't usually get the source code, right? So it's kind of like, oh, I have the answer key. Finally, like, how did I do? I wanted to see, like, I named all these functions, right? And, I play around with my names sometimes because it's for me and I know what I'm looking at. But how accurate were my function names compared to what they were actually called in the source code? So I took a single function, and you can see on the left here, there's a decompilation from IDA-Pro. So these are all my function names that I gave these functions. And on the right is the actual source code with the function names that the malware author gave. Now, most of the names, I was pretty close or almost like exactly accurate to the actual name of the function. And I'm not going to talk about the cases where I was right, because that's kind of boring, and we don't have time for that. But let's talk about some of the places where I was wrong or just a little off, and I think those are more interesting. So at the top on the right here, there's a comment for this function, kind of overview of what the function does. And roughly translated to English, that comment says, fulfills commands at once after launching bot. And the name of their function, they named it first execute commands. I named this function do some things. And I named it that because this function doesn't really do anything in particular. It's actually just calling a bunch of other commands and other functions in the program to perform functionality. It's kind of like an init script for this backdoor, right? So I just kind of joked and was like, yeah, it's just doing stuff. I would have called it init, but there's another function I already named init in there. So I was like, yeah, it just does stuff, right? So they call it first execute commands. Technically, I think I was pretty accurate, but obviously the name was quite off from what they called it. Next up, on the right here, they named this function load keylogger config. Now, at the time, when I was looking at this function, it was really complicated. There's not a lot of context here. It was doing a lot of things with those named pipes I was talking about. It was sending messages around. There were no Windows APIs being called. I really didn't know what the function was for other than to send messages across these named pipes. And the only message I saw was the string klg config. Now, I assumed that klg stood for keylog, so it was talking about like a keylog config, but there was nothing to do with keylogging at all in that function, right? Again, it's just like sending a message over a pipe. So I didn't know, and I didn't want to make any assumptions. So when I named this function, I just named it literally after exactly what it does. So it's a really long function name that has no meaning to anyone here except for me or anyone else who has reverse engineered Carbanak like me. So I called it send klg config plug name manager pipe messages. Right? Whatever, it doesn't mean anything to you guys. But that's what it is. So I was off there because I didn't have the full context. And lastly, I wanted to point out, oops, I went back.
Can we back up one?
Please?
Thank you.
I wanted to point out one thing. Down here at the bottom, it's calling this function command exec. And it's calling the command runmem, which I've already analyzed. And I know that runmem is going to download some binary from the internet and load it in memory and run it. But it's never going to touch disk. That binary is never touching disk, right? So that's what runmem command does. And it's calling runmem on this executable they named wi.exe. I don't know what wi.exe is, right? At the time, I didn't have that binary. There's nothing in the code else that talks about wi.exe. So it was a mystery to me. This is one of those blind spots that Mike was talking about. I had no context. All I knew it was going to run some binary that it downloads from a server, and they call it wi.exe. So I'm just calling that out now because Mike is going to talk about that shortly.
So you'd think we might be all done at this point. We've reviewed the binaries by the hundreds, and we've looked over the source code, and we've seen all of our blind spots, but we were not done. We were far from done. There was like twice as much work to be done because basically we had to go through all the binaries and reverse them and make sure we had fully accurate reports on them. It wasn't enough to have a high level, and it wasn't enough to leave it with any uncertainty. We really needed to figure out for sure and have some facts on these binaries. So I'm going to talk about a few of these, just 3 of them, and I'll leave them up on the screen so you can see them all, but I'm just going to talk about 3. Carbanak, a compiled version of Carbanak. Ironically, not the star of the show. There's no incentive for me to analyze this other than to find deviations, of which there were none. And so it's kind of a nothing burger that we have a copy of Carbanak because I'm looking at the source code. Now, the mysterious wi.exe, that turned out to be web injection. And what web injection is for is either scraping passwords or other sensitive information from a web session, or modifying a web session so that a transaction might take place to a different account. You can pretty much manipulate what the web client does on that machine. Between here and the bottom, we have a few commercially and publicly available things. We have Metasploit shellcode that is a stager for Metasploit. We have some Cobalt Strike stuff. At the bottom, we have an open source project as well, and it's called RDP Wrap. And its purpose is to let more than one user RDP, or remote desktop, into that machine so they can all see what's going on the machine without interrupting each other. And the purpose then would be to log in while a user is on the machine and still be using the machine without interrupting that legitimate user and blowing your operation. Yeah. So it turns out that this was compiled into Carbanak, and he'd reversed it, and he was kind of like, why do we have this? Well, that was also, they were using Mimikatz to do kind of the same thing, and they had preprocessor macros surrounding that, and essentially probably foresaw a case where they would maybe send Carbanak without this feature or functionality and then download it separately. But that's not all. After that, we wrote some finished intelligence, a finished intelligence product that went on our intelligence portal. So the iSight intelligence portal now has a 75-page report that covers the findings. And I wanted to involve this guy and share some of his work because he did some interesting and compelling video work. And I want to let him talk about that.
Thanks, Mike. So a few years ago, Kaspersky put out this paper that was really intriguing, where it talked about this financial criminal group that was using Carbanak to rob banks. So what they would do is they would spend some weeks or some months kind of as a shadow employee of a given bank, shoulder surfing on the employees of that bank using the desktop video recording feature of Carbanak. They would watch the employees do their work. They would see what tools they use, what processes they have in place, what their rules are, and how they do their work. And when they felt comfortable, they would come on in, insert fraudulent transactions that would not trigger any alerts, and then make out with millions of dollars. It's pretty incredible, pretty intense.
And he called it job shadowing.
Yeah, like they're employees of the bank for a little while.
I love it.
They get their pay, right? So, yeah, and we had access to some of these videos of this Carbanak backdoor video recording feature. The problem was these videos apparently were not the right format, because even though we had the video player ourselves from the source dump, we tried to play them and it just wasn't happening. And it turned out that these videos were of an older format. It's a proprietary format to these guys. They wrote their own video player and their own file format for the videos. But we had the code, so I knew we could figure this out. And it wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be. It turns out that the old version of the code was still in the comments. So all I had to do was comment in the old loop for playing a video, and it worked. So I was like, sweet. Now we have the videos. Unfortunately, the videos were not very interesting, except for one video that I wanted Mike to talk about, because he has some background that he can relate to this video.
Yeah, so this is basically, we're shoulder surfing an attacker, an operator of other people's systems. And in this screenshot, there are a couple things of interest. It looks like they've got their canned list of, kind of a hot list of commands they're going to use in an operation. And as a former red teamer in the Mandiant red team, this felt familiar to me. It feels like that moment when you're about to operate against your target. You're going to phish them, get into their network, and your hands are sweaty, and you want to test your commands. You want to make sure that your persistence is working, that you didn't misspell anything, that you don't have any Windows file length limitation conflicts. Nothing wrong. Make sure that your operations can go perfectly smoothly. Just nothing untested before you go into that new territory. And so the odd thing here is, though, Carbanak is nowhere to be seen. There's no Carbanak visible. They're not operating Carbanak. And Carbanak has all these features. It has persistence. It has screenshotting like they're doing in PowerShell here in the middle. It has all these things. Like, why is Carbanak absent? Why are they doing this other stuff? And why are they being videotaped? So it lends to the question, who is being shoulder surfed? Do they know that they're being shoulder surfed? And in wild speculation, I like to think that maybe it could be an employee of Combi Security, one of those unwitting accomplices, maybe getting ready to do just a normal pen test for a customer who wasn't really a customer, and maybe somebody was supervising and doing a little bit of quality assurance to make sure that they're not filtering the goods. I just don't know otherwise what this means.
Yeah.
So this interesting tidbit takes us to the end. We have a few takeaways. Sometimes the source code really doesn't help. Hard code is hard. It just doesn't matter where you encounter it or at what level you look at it. If it's complicated, sometimes it's just complicated. Take a lot of time to look at. Naturally, though, source code does come with unique discoveries, and we were fortunate to find that, and we're thankful for the advanced practices team for capturing that source code. And also, the Carbanak authors, they did a lot of custom stuff, but they're really not averse to pulling in public things. They have no shame about pulling in Mimikatz, Metasploit stuff, Cobalt Strike, etc.
Right, and we confirmed some theories from the blog, right? So having the source code helped us see that we were actually right in a lot of those conclusions in the blog. And even though we didn't have the answers, I mean, just through enough research and having a large enough sample set, you can come to conclusions that are accurate, right? So it's just kind of cool to have that proven. And also vindication, right? Binary analysis was spot on. Again, we don't usually get the answer key, so like, it was kind of nerve-wracking for me to like, be like, oh, Mike's going to find out if I was correct about everything. And he certainly let me know that I was, so that was really cool.
Yeah, it was a very high-quality analysis, so kudos to you.
Thank you.
So we want to leave it at Q&A. We have run out of time. I don't know, Ian, do we have any time for any last questions?
There's Ian.
Oh, there you go.
Coming over. Sorry. I was hiding. So yeah, we are out of time for questions, but I did want to throw one quick one out there for you guys, and that's as you were going through the source code review, did you come across any anti-RE stuff that Tom had to deal with along the way?
I would say that whole named pipe thing was anti-RE.
Yep.
Just normally it's a single switch statement. Only one of those blocks that he showed of the 7 is really strictly necessary to evaluate which command is going to run. It felt like that whole thing was just like, I'm just going to make this take forever for you. Enjoy this.
Great.
Also for all the string comparisons they were doing with AV process names, or even the command names, the names of the commands that Carbanak would execute, they weren't in there. They had the hashes of the strings instead. So they were comparing hashes, and I had to brute force and guess at the names of at a lot of those commands and a lot of those process names. I didn't get every single one, but I did get a lot. So Mike was able to actually show me the ones that I didn't
the source code was pretty much wide open, like, here I am, fortunately. I mean, no obfuscation there.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys very much for the talk today. I hope everybody here enjoyed it. We do have another talk related to Fin7 here coming up in about 10 minutes. So get back here for 5:30, where we'll be applying some Fin7 TTPs to a couple of different attack frameworks.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.